My name is David Goyes from the University of Oslo, and I'm here today with Professor Nigel South from the University of Essex for the Green Criminology Oral History Project. So, welcome, Nigel.
Good to be here.
So, you have had a remarkable career. You received the 2013 Lifetime Achievement Award of the American Society of Criminology. In 2014, you became the Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences.
This is all a polite way of saying I'm very old, isn't it?
Yeah, and following your achievements throughout the years. In 2022, you received the Outstanding Achievement Award by the British Society of Criminology. And you have published well-cited and influential books and articles in the fields of drug markets, drug trafficking, of course, green criminology, but also criminology, a sociological introduction, together with your colleagues. You have also written about policing, private policing, and more. But my first question, because we started by the end, when you received all these awards and you have all these influential publications, but my first question for you is about your background. Where do you come from? How were your formative years? And how did that influence your scholarship? But maybe we can start from the start.
Okay, well, I come from Leeds in the north of England. It was an industrial town or city. My parents were old enough to have just served in the war, but I grew up in was born and grew up in the 1950s when there was still the aftermath and reconstruction period after war. There was still a period of rationing when I was still a small child. So the world was really quite different. I remember Rob White and I wrote an introduction, or wrote an essay for something that Bob Agnew had organised for the ASC. And we decided to start by just contrasting some childhood memories. And Rob had a memory of swimming in Canada, because he's actually Canadian, not Australian, in a beautiful lake that was clean and pollution-free. And he said, well, it probably isn't pollution-free now. And my memory was being on a bus going through central Leeds at a time when pollution in the atmosphere was still generated by heavy industry and coal-burning home fires, because there was no regulation about this. This was just, there'd just been regulation, clean air regulation, but it was still phasing through. So I just remember being on this bus as a small child, and there was pollution outside, what's called smog, a combination of smoke and fog, and pollution inside, because also in those days people smoked cigarettes a lot. So you had this lemony sort of light within the bus, through this foggy haze within the bus and with outside the bus. So that was a formative memory of growing up in a city that was much like many cities in the UK, or perhaps the Western world at that time, that were not very healthy cities. And as I grew older, I began to like being out of the city, and I think this may anticipate some of your later questions. I liked being in nature, I liked being in woodland, I liked going to the coast, and so earliest memories of an industrial city, and then sometimes escaping from the city.
All right, but take me back also, because before you started writing about green criminology, you decided to study first sociology and then a PhD in criminology. What led you to decide to study sociology? Where did your interest come from?
Right, well, I went to what were in the UK called grammar schools. They were originally quite elite schools, but they established more that were about giving opportunities to children who might have come from the working class but were bright and needed to be given the best opportunities, educational opportunities in the 1950s and 1960s. And so I went to this school which was quite good, and I found I wasn't very good at various things, but I was good at part of the economics curriculum. I was not good at the mathematics part, but I was good at the part that was about social economics. They didn't teach sociology in schools in those days. It was an American kind of idea. But this idea of social economics, which is basically about sociological issues and public policy issues, really interested me. And when I started to look at universities, there weren't many universities that did it. Essex was one. So I lived in the north of England, so like many young people, I wanted to move away from the family home and from parents. So that was moving to Essex, the south of England, was one choice. But Essex was then and still is a very good department for sociology. So I thought, well, I'll try that. And it was near London, which is also of interest to young people. And it turned out to be a very good department and a very good decision. How did I move on to other things? I guess the teachers that I had. One of the teachers was Ken Plummer, who was a rising young star at the time, writing about sociology of deviance at the time, but then becoming a pioneer about narrative sociology and human sexualities. But the other key figure at that period who arrived about the same time at Essex as I did was Stanley Cohen. And he'd just published Folk Devils and Moral Panics. And I remember doing the second year Sociology of Deviance course with Stan talking about his fieldwork research in Clacton. And this was all fascinating and wonderful. And I thought, well, this is really very interesting. I wonder if there's more that you can do here. And I stayed at Essex to then do a master's and then moved on to Middlesex to do a PhD, which is a different story if you want that one as well.
Yeah, I would like to have that one, the decision to move forward with the PhD.
Well, the main thing that governs most people's decision to do a PhD, I would like to say is intellectual, but actually it's money, of course, because you need the fees and the living accommodation and so on. But Stan knew somebody who had a grant at Middlesex University, or Polytechnic as it was, and it wasn't Jock Young. But I knew Jock was there because I'd met him through Ken. You have to also realise this is early to late 70s, this period, and the world of sociology of deviance and criminology was relatively small then compared to how it is now, and people knew each other across Europe. Anyway, I got this scholarship with Jerry Mars, who was a social anthropologist, wonderful guy, and Jock became my other supervisor. And Jerry's PhD, Jerry's big program was, as an anthropologist, looking at occupational cultures, i.e. the world of work of waiters in hotels or other kinds of jobs that people do. And he wanted me to be a garbage man, to be a waste disposal man. And I thought, I don't really want to do that. But Jerry, there's an area of policing where people wear uniforms and they have a community, an occupational community, because they work shifts and people don't really understand them. So they had all the ingredients of an occupational community that nobody's really studied before. And this is private security. Could I do that? He said, oh, that's interesting. You go do that. So I did that, and that's how. And I knew that some people in the States and Canada had just started to do some work on this field. But very few people had. That was Robert White in the United States and Clifford Shearing and Phil Stanley in Toronto. Apart from that, there was very little doing on that. So I knew that I could contribute to the sociology of policing in doing something that not many people had done at the time.
And that was the connection with criminology. When you do policing, you're very near criminology.
Yeah. I mean, well, again, it was different times. So a lot of people who now do say we are criminologists would actually back then have called themselves sociologists or sociologists of deviance, because criminology still had a very positivist kind of approach. In the UK, it was dominated by places like Cambridge and seen as very much a preserve of an establishment criminology. So people like Jock and Stan and others who were, and Ken, who were foundational for the National Deviancy Conference, very much saw themselves as kind of sociologists in revolt against this criminological establishment. So whether you call it sociology or criminology, it was a part of the emerging critical, what we came to call critical criminology.
So you have become mentor for many people I was looking at your bio at the University of Essex, and you write, "I'm retired, but still emeritus. And if you have a question, just send me an email."
Yeah.
And that means, and I know that you're collaborating with many young people. I'm not that young anymore, but I started writing with you more than a decade ago. And my question is, how did the experience of working with or being mentored by these big stars that you mentioned, Ken Plummer, Jock Young, Stanley Cohen, shaped you as a mentor or as a colleague? What did they teach you at the time?
Generosity, modesty, whatever. Stan was very individualistic, so I don't think Stan collaborated with many people, if anyone. Well, apart from Laurie Taylor, of course, he had a long-standing relationship of writing and researching with Laurie Taylor. But both Jock and Ken were very generous with their ideas and working together. Ken was also a solitary intellectual, but he was very generous with his ideas and wanted to inspire people. Ken was a great believer in C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination, and you can see that in the way that he presents the way his work on documents of life and narrative sociology and humanistic sociology and sociology of sexualities, all of these are about broadening the sociological imagination in a liberating sort of way. Jock was always open to sharing ideas and collaborating, and wasn't at all a precious or elitist sort of person. So very early on when I was doing my PhD, he said, yeah, you should be concentrating on your PhD, but we need to finish this project. Why don't you come and be the research officer for 3 months, and we'll just concentrate on that, and you can go back to the PhD afterwards. And I thought, well, this is great. I can work with Jock, and I can get some more money, and we can do this project. It was called the Student Culture Project. It was about student politics, student drug use, and student life generally. And it became a little report. It was never published, but a little report. And Jock put the data analyst, John Crutchley, first, and then me second, and Young third. Jock had done most of the work, of course. I'd done the data gathering. John had done the data crunching. Jock had done most of the analysis, or actually all the analysis. And I thought this is a fantastic kind of model from somebody who actually is, a rising superstar. He wasn't yet Jock Young. And I thought, well, there's an interesting sort of example of how you can encourage people and work with people and get things on people's CVs. And I've always thought that was a rather obvious thing for us to do, because once you are established, you don't really need to be trying to exploit other people or not give credit to other people. But the writing thing with other people also became a necessity when I did have the job in the 1980s working in the drugs field at the Institute for the Study of Drug Dependence, because we had small teams working as teams, and we wrote as teams, and we published as teams. So generally speaking, in alphabetical order, regardless of contribution. So that was another kind of good education about how to juggle multiple projects and work together and publish together, and reduce the ego involved in writing together as well.
So you describe them as different. Stanley as more individualistic, and then Jock as more collaborative.
Well,
but what did they have in common, all three of them?
Ken and Stan and Jock?
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, Ken had been a student of both, I think, and had worked at what became Middlesex, the Enfield College of Technology, and I think both of them had worked there at one time. So they had a shared history. As I say, it was a relatively small world, and they knew people in common, like Paul Rock at the London School of Economics. Stan was wanted to follow an intellectual path, which was really quite interesting. So, as I say, I did the undergraduate degree with him, and it was really interesting to hear him talk about folk devils and moral panics, a study that had only been published 2 or 3 years later. I did the MA with him 1 or 2 years later, and I thought we'd be talking more about that and critical criminology from America. And he said, right, well, this term we're going to read this book called I, Pierre Rivière, Having Murdered My Mother and Father by somebody called Michel Foucault. This is not what I thought we were going to be doing this, and that was his new intellectual project. And he was interested in surveillance, and he was interested in Foucault's ideas before Discipline and Punish was published. And that all fed into The Punitive City and the book that he then did about social control, Visions of Social Control. So he had a kind of path that he was working through intellectually. You can see that and all of them were involved in the National Deviancy Conference, which was this riposte to the establishment, the traditional criminology establishment at Cambridge and elsewhere, the Home Office and so on. And they're all involved in that National Deviancy Conference. But Jock very early on decided that that movement needed if not a Bible, at least a major text, and that was the New Criminology. And the way to do that was to work with others, and he worked with Ian Taylor and Paul Walton to produce what was, in retrospect, a slightly incoherent text, but at the time a hugely influential kind of discipline-changing text.
So you have mentioned some of these big reference for different scholars. You mentioned Foucault, and some others have used Bourdieu and other philosophers and sociologists. But in your work, in your own work, I have not seen an attachment to a big name, but more the use of different references in different fields and different locations. So my question is, what are or what have been the main sources of inspiration for your own scholarship?
Well, varied, because I don't see myself as a very disciplined scholar or intellectual, unlike some colleagues of mine. I always cite my colleague Eamon Carabine as somebody who is, I think, a very disciplined scholar, very focused.
Disciplined in which way? Disciplined in work ethics, or disciplined?
To concentrate on a project. He's still working on his visual criminology Leverhulme project, and is immensely knowledgeable about art history and the links of the visual to symbols and messages of punishment. And it's been a long project. I would run out of patience, so I jump about between things, so I lack that discipline in that sense of being focused. And I've always found that an interesting way to approach things, because I think that's another manifestation of what Ken called the sociological imagination, because you're constantly finding sociologically interesting things. Some things were ideas that only sort of came to fruition in my head or work or some years later, and that I've realised. And one was your influence, working with you on issues to do with indigenous communities, a southern green perspective and things like that. But then remembering back to the days when the National Deviancy Conference and the Conference of Socialist Economists, this was about 1978-79, had an international conference, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos came and was talking about epistemological amnesias and biases and things. I think we're in that very first book that he did around that. And of course, Rosa del Olmo used to come to the European conferences, and I don't know if Rosa ever came to the flat we all lived in London, but I knew of her work. So there were some formative influences that probably took a long time to come out into my thinking, and some of that was partly due to you. I don't know, what other influences were there?
You have one main name that you follow and use repeatedly. Yeah.
No, probably not. I mean, there was a time when, as my wife said, we were all Marxists once, but that didn't last.
Yeah. But it seems at some point everyone was using Foucault
Yeah.
Like Foucault was the reference you would find in every text, but it
Yeah.
doesn't seem like you were following his ideas all that strictly, at least.
No, I think because the PhD was about private security and private policing, there was some work by one of Foucault's colleagues or students, Pasquino, which was published in Ideology and Consciousness, which I found quite influential. And what I liked about that work, and there's some other work that came from that grouping, and I don't know where it was published originally in French, but it was, as I say, in English, it was in this journal, long gone, Ideology and Consciousness, that did take that Foucauldian idea of the social policing, so that incorporated the regulation of everyday life, of health, of the weighing of food, of the colour of houses or whatever. And I found that quite fascinating and stimulating as an idea when I was working around policing. But then I also could get quite impatient or annoyed with Foucault scholars who would claim that all of this kind of work were insights that no one had ever had before. And actually, no, if you look at work by some American symbolic interactionists, their work is full of the minor regulations of everyday life that guide us through a building or down a street or in interactions with each other. And you could have, today you could use ChatGPT, say rewrite symbolic interactionism about the petty rules of everyday life into Foucauldian language, and you'd get something that looked very Foucauldian. So I got a bit impatient with some of that. And of course other people had similar ideas as well. And people like David Lyon had been writing about surveillance technologies for a long time before it became very fashionable, and then he became a big figure, a big scholar. He moved from Ilkley in North Yorkshire, a small college, to eventually being in Canada. So again, that's a parallel with some of the critique of the way that Southern criminology took off without necessarily acknowledging people who had been before or said very similar things. There's no problem in referencing in a footnote, by the way, David Lyon said this in 19 whatever, or by the way, if you look at the work of this symbolic interactionist, this is quite similar. So, but no, I've never had a single pathway. Or
And you have worked in private policing. You said that was for the money. That was an opportunity there.
Well, it was how it really came about. Okay, I don't know how long you want this to go on. My master's, as an undergraduate student, I had worked on building sites. In the United Kingdom, building sites often had payments that could avoid tax by paying cash at the end of the week, and it was called the lump, and it was a tax avoidance thing that was very, very well known and culturally accepted to some extent, and it's part of what was called the hidden economy. So when I went to work, and I was very interested in that. So my master's dissertation, which wasn't great but was okay, was about examples of the hidden economy here in the United States. And the response to the hidden economy is basically private policing, because the police can't take on workplace crime, workplace theft, and so on. And Jerry Mars's occupational cultures project was very much partly about the way in which people might be in low-paid occupations, but they supplemented their wages by petty theft or perks or fiddles or whatever, or pilferage. And so that framework was part of his project. So I could also say, well, actually, the response to that is this growing industry of private policing, private security and surveillance cameras and undercover officers and things like that. So there was a genuine kind of trajectory about why I ended up with private policing, quite apart from the doctoral grant, yes.
And I think the next block of your research or career was drug markets, drug trafficking, drug use.
Well, it was drugs and everything.
So
really.
how did that happen? How did you move from policing to drugs?
It's going to sound incredibly mercenary. I needed a job. So I was still doing the PhD, but the grant had run out, partly because Jock said let's do other things. And because I'd done something on student culture, and I'd also had an interest in media courses at university, I met somebody who said, well, there's a job coming at the Institute for the Study of Drug Dependence. It's only short term, but it's a project about media and alcohol, and then they want to do something about youth subcultures and alcohol perhaps as well. This was right at the start of the 1980s. And again, I can talk more about why that was a very important or significant point in the 1980s, if you want. But I got that short-term job and it turned into, I suppose I may as well explain then why it became longer term. At the start of the 1980s in the UK, the main substance misuse problems of concern to the government or the newspapers or the population were alcohol and glue sniffing, solvent sniffing. There'd been minor heroin and other kinds of serious drug problems in the 1960s and 70s, but they were always really quite small scale compared to the kind of media attention that they got and the mythology that surrounded them. And cannabis just kind of ticked over. And then around the early 1980s, 82, 83, various geopolitical events around the world, particularly the fall of the Shah of Iran and changes in Afghanistan, meant that there was heroin flowing to Europe and to the UK, and it was at first a smokable form of heroin, so it didn't seem quite as intimidating or dangerous as injectables, but it really took off, and suddenly the UK had a heroin problem, which it didn't really know what to do with, because heroin is what America has, it's not what the UK or Western Europe has. And it became an injecting problem as well. And there was a need to develop services, develop education, develop social work applications, develop criminological research. And we started to get these projects that responded to the different needs across different services, working with schools, working with social work, working with psychiatrists, working with health services. So it was very, very mixed. And then, of course, working on criminological issues like drug trafficking and policing through that period. So it was a very interesting period, quite an intense period. And then in terms of what kept driving it, injectables turned into an AIDS crisis because that's a bloodborne transmission. And then cocaine and crack appeared from America. So it was a decade of lots of activity and various publications. What was really very useful to me was being interdisciplinary. So fairly interdisciplinary team, and you had to work with interdisciplinary audiences or constituencies that wanted whatever we were trying to do in different projects. And that was very valuable in all my subsequent career, working as a director of a health institute, working with students from different backgrounds, and then doing university management stuff and working with external agencies.
So it seems like that was a very intense and productive time in your career, because I think that was also kind of the 90s, mid-90s, when you started thinking much more about the global. It seems like criminologists only started noticing the global, or at least Anglophone criminologists.
Well, so that was the 1980s.
Yeah.
But, yes, so to start thinking about drugs in a geopolitical context meant you had to think about the global. And I did 2 or 3 papers or chapters with 2 other, well, one was a colleague, Nicholas Dawn at ISDD, and another colleague from Middlesex, John Old, sadly also died far too young. And that's where we started to look at Latin America and how drugs were a commodity for Latin American countries that might be in search of foreign exchange because they were being manipulated by international producers and the United States in particular. We tried to understand the political economy of drug production in Latin America, and I don't know that it was very successful, but at least, as you say, we were trying to think globally and particularly in relation to Latin America at a time when, unless, within criminology anyway, many people weren't. Of course, you could have gone to political science or geographical topics or whatever, and they would have been looking at these issues. But criminology was still quite transatlantic and inward-looking, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, because interestingly, even Jock Young, he writes about the UK. Many of the big names of that time in criminology, it seems to be very focused on Europe and the local. What do you think is the cause of that? Why were they stuck in the local?
Writing about the people that were influential, or just
their research interests, the problems they were looking at, or not acknowledging the global interconnections, the global injustices as much as we're doing today.
Right. I don't really know. I suppose the rest of the world wasn't seen as having a voice. The same sort of perhaps interpersonal connections were harder to make. People forget how the internet and the sharing of information through email and web-based sources has revolutionised things and made things so much easier than when you used to have to send things in a letter by post to somewhere across the world, where it may get there or it may not, and take quite a long time to go backwards and forwards, or you could phone people. But that's not to say that people, as I say, didn't make those connections. Rosa del Olmo was a pioneer who did come over to Europe and go to the European Group of Deviance and Social Control. Spent some time, I think, in parts of Europe, maybe, I don't know, maybe not Norway, maybe...
Even Norway, with Niels.
And I think others did. But, you yourself have written about a period in Latin American history when it wasn't very easy for critical scholars to be doing anything outside of maybe legal scholarship. And the United States has always been kind of inward-looking anyway. I think it was quite interesting that they became Europeanised after a while of being very, very British. And Ian Taylor was a very strong voice for a European criminology. And of course, the famous story of how the European Group for the Study of Deviance and Social Control came about, and that was because Stan Cohen and Mario Simondi, was it, and somebody from Germany, I think, were all visiting the University of California, Berkeley or somewhere, around the same time and around the same corridor. This is the story as it goes. It might be partly made up. And they said, well, here we are in California. What we need is a European grouping network. And they came back and they created the basis of the European group. It's written up in Stan's introduction to the first set of essays that was produced by the European group, probably around 73, 74. So I think it was quite radical to be Europeanising at the time. There were some contacts. I suppose there were other contacts that were global, but this was also, in the UK's terms anyway, the end of its empire, the end of its kind of colonial period. So there were also some links that were very, very colonial, and really people didn't necessarily want to go near those.
Yeah. Right, so this is the oral history project of the European group, of the Green Criminology group. So we have to talk about green criminology. Mm-hmm. How did green criminology come about in your thinking and scholarship?
Right. Well, I suppose, like many people's experiences, it is a combination of opportunities and personal interests and excitement when you think you've found something new to do. So, as I've said, I had an interest in nature, the environment, or not in a mountain climbing sort of way. I just liked being in the open and nature. And you've seen that I later got involved with some of our colleagues in biological sciences about their green exercise kind of project, and the idea that being in nature is good for your mental health, which always seemed to be a very self-evident idea, but it appeared to take scientists quite a long time to realise this. I'm not quite sure why. So there was a personal interest, and then the opportunity was I'd inherited from Ken Plummer, actually, the only criminology course that the University of Essex had at the time, around 1996, I guess. No, 94, but 93, 94. And so I completely redid it because a lot of Ken's work had been about sexualities and so on. And so I wanted the new frontier, a section on new frontiers of criminology, so radical history, feminism, postmodernism, and I thought, what else can I add? And I thought, well, nobody really talks about the state of the planet, about environmental issues, which is really quite odd. And you can find it in corporate crime studies. There were quite a lot of American studies about corporate crime or the problems of unregulated big business, where the consequences, the impacts were environmentally damaging to farmers, to populations and so on. And we use one of the best examples of that, I think, is Harvey Mollich's study of the Santa Barbara oil spill, where he's got a very nice sociological take on it. But it was neither seen as green nor critical criminology. It was just a good case study, although I would see it as kind of a critical criminology case study. So I thought, well, all this corporate crime stuff is interesting and we can draw on it, but its focus is the corporation as the offender. Its focus is, and if its focus is at all about victims, it's victims of, in legal terms, of cars that go badly wrong or something. No one's really talking about the environment as the victim. So I thought, well, let's see what we can do here. And so I had to put together a reading list, and there really wasn't very much. And that's where the letters across the world come in, because I'd come across a paper that Piers Byrne had written about wildlife, about animal cruelty or something. He'd done it at a conference, I think, in Europe. And I wrote to him and said, have you published this? Is it available? And this is the serious bit about writing to people. You put something back then you put something in the mail and it goes to Maine, New England, and 2 weeks later Piers might get it and then reply and send something back. Anyway, it's the paper that eventually became his very influential paper, Speciesism and Criminology and so on. And we started to exchange work around that and I tried to build up my reading list. And so the paper that eventually went into the special issue of Theoretical Criminology that we published in 98 was based on a lecture that I'd started doing about 1995, 96. So sometimes lectures start out as ideas and then end up as a paper. And I was just talking to somebody just earlier today, a colleague here at Oslo, about that special issue, and she said, how did it come about that you got a special issue of Theoretical Criminology? I said, well, partly Piers was a co-editor at the time, but we'd also tried to get publishers interested in a co-edited book. No publisher was interested in this strange idea of green criminology. So we did the special issue of the journal, which was probably the best thing to do, but at the time, people weren't interested.
So that was in the 90s. And green criminology is often and still referred to this as this young subdiscipline in criminology, but I don't think it's that young anymore.
No, probably not.
30-something years. How would you describe the state of green criminology today?
Well, it's obviously flourished. There are numerous books and edited collections. There's always been a bit of a debate within the green criminology community about whether there should be a dedicated journal for it. I never really thought that was a good idea, because I think we would tend to isolate ourselves within a journal, and it would be difficult to run, and I don't really. Once we've started to publish in the most prestigious journals that there are internationally, why would we want to do that? We can create our own web pages. We now have the European group, European Society working group, and we can put together edited collections and things. So I think we've got enough outlets now, and it is a part of. So you mentioned the textbook that I and colleagues do. Rob White also does a textbook, and I remember Rob saying when he gave the speech where Piers Byrne and I shared the Lifetime Achievement Award at the ASC, he said something about both. Oh, and that's it. Piers Byrne's also been co-author of various editions of a textbook. Rob said, well, you know, people might say, oh, textbooks are not very important or whatever, but actually textbooks are really important because they shape the field. They shape what students and teachers think the important issues in the field are. So actually, don't leave the writing of textbooks to the establishment, the traditionals. It's very important that critical thinkers write textbooks because they shape the field. And so now most textbooks will have a chapter on green criminology, and whether they are green criminologists themselves or not. And so one of the leading ones in the UK is Tim Newburn's very hefty green criminology book, and it already had, I think, 2 editions when Tim wrote to me and said, doing a new edition, really need to include green criminology. Can you send me a load of stuff? So I sent him a load of stuff, and you know, that's once you're in the Oxford Handbook of Criminology, or if you're in Tim Newburn's big textbook, you are part of, I think, what people have to see as the field. It may not be the dominant part of the field, but it's certainly a recognised part of the field.
So there are many other disciplines, fields, researching on environmental harms and crimes and crises and so on, like political ecology, economy, sociology, history, and so on. What is it unique to criminology? What does green criminology bring to the table of knowledge when we have so many disciplines researching the same?
Well, a lot and nothing. A lot because, of course, it's a different discipline. It does have its own history, trajectory, and ways of looking at the world. And that's not just crime, of course, because one of the most significant things about a green criminology has been the emphasis on harm. And that's been there right from the start. And I always get cross with semiologists who say, yes, we invented a social harm approach. No, you didn't. Because, you know, green criminology right from the start was saying part of the issue is that harmful activities are not made illegal, are not regulated or criminalised, but they are nonetheless incredibly damaging to the environment, the planet, to people, to species, other species, and so on. So I think the concepts that criminology brings, as well as a very fertile range of theoretical perspectives, and that's always been important, I think, about a green criminology. It's never claimed to have a theory. It's an umbrella. It's a way of looking at the world, a way of being sensitised to the world. You can bring many different things into this umbrella, but also draw upon a very rich variety of criminological perspectives, which may mean people disagree or whatever. On the other hand, I think the other strength of that umbrella, or whatever metaphor you kind of want to use, is it's a very open field and it's a very interdisciplinary field. And actually, it would be difficult for it to survive or to demonstrate data, for example, or evidence arguments, without drawing upon other disciplines, without drawing upon other perspectives. Any work on climate change has to draw upon the work of the scientists of climate change. Any work on wildlife issues and other species issues probably has to draw upon the work of those who catalogue the decline of other species, or the trades that are regulated by or monitored by other agencies and so on. So I think we have a lot still to draw on from other perspectives, ecological sciences, political science, and so on, while still having some kind of identity as a green criminology, although both you and I have also written in a way the label doesn't matter that much as long as you're trying to pursue the general mission of saying the planet and the species that share it are not in good shape. We really need to draw attention to this.
And where do you think green criminology should go forward? What are the gaps you identify or the important aspects to be studied?
Well, most of my past answers are now kind of conditioned by the politics of the world that we're in. I used to say things like, why do people know all the evidence about climate change or the world's not in a good shape, but still engage in everyday denial and so on. And there's lots of very interesting, fascinating work being done on that in the past and continuing. And that extends to why don't people worry about the next generation? Most people are very worried about their children and their children's children, but they don't seem to worry about the future in that sense. And there are particular gaps within a green criminology or critical green criminology or whatever we want to call it that have always astonished me. There's relatively little work done on women or gender issues or women and environmental issues. And I remember years ago there was a very stimulating, interesting book called The Rape of the Wild by Collard and Contrucci, which was, from a feminist point of view, paralleling the masculine male rape of women and the masculine male rape of nature and the wild. And it's a critique of masculinity and men and the way that they shape and militarise and exploit and so on. And actually there's not a lot. Ragnall's done a little bit and a few other people have done something. If you look at it, it's very strange that there's not more of a kind of critical feminist or eco-feminist green criminology. But the politics of the current moment, with the rise of populism, Trump and the kind of support that he's got, the work that I'm doing at the moment is with two colleagues about eco-fascism, which is how right-wing political groups are incorporating environmental messages in an anti-immigration, border control sort of way, and nobody seems to notice or care. Indeed, they're applauding it. Makes me think, well, it's we've really got to understand political forces better, because when I was younger I might have been optimistic. Now I'm older, I'm increasingly pessimistic. But I think if we look around the world, the rise of authoritarian parties and populism and governments that don't really care about the planet, I think criminology's agenda has to at least try and engage with understanding what's going on there.
Yeah. So I think part of the value of this oral history projects is for younger generations to learn from the experience of people who have done many things. So I want to go back to what we have discussed and ask you a couple of questions about your experience. And the first one is, it seems like the labor market today is very volatile. Short contracts, postdocs, people flying from one country to another to take another postdoc, another project, and so on. But it seems like somehow that benefited you, because it seems like, of course, it was different times, different conditions, but you also started in private policing and then moved to drug markets, drug use, and also had kind of this experience of finding employment while benefiting from exploring different topics and different perspectives. So how do you navigate or evaluate that experience of having to start in a completely different field and how that shaped your view?
Well, you're right. I think higher education and opportunities in, well, teaching or research looks quite tight here in Europe and in the United States and Australia, I think. And so it might be that in hindsight, the 1990s and the 2000s and the early 2010s were the anomaly. That's when things expanded and there was money in the system. Because I was at ISDD through the 1980s. There were no jobs in universities in the UK because the government of the day didn't like universities, and they certainly didn't like social sciences. So, been there before to some extent, and now we have contraction in the UK because there are funding difficulties, and I think that's probably the case in other places as well, certainly in the United States, especially if you have a president like Trump who is constricting university budgets and state budgets and things like that. Moving on, I don't think that things necessarily stopped and I moved on to something else because ideas, projects, interests, knowledge stays with you, and it might just be that in my case, you kind of find something new to focus on. But so when I went to Essex, I thought, well, I'm not going to do any more drugs research. I've done that for 10 years, but of course, then people ask you to do something or something new comes along, and so that becomes an interesting thing to go back to. And it's very interesting to be then working with you on issues to do with resource exploitation in Latin America, because one of the obvious questions there is, okay, well, who protects the exploiters? Well, paramilitaries, private police, government troops, the policing vanguard of the state and the corporations. And so we wrote together about something, a little case study in Colombia, but also with examples from elsewhere, that was about private security, but in a different context. So that was quite important to me in a way to sort of revisit some of that and think, okay, well, that was an old interest, but here I am applying it new in a new context with a new colleague, and that was really a very interesting and good project to do. And the green criminology work has, as I said, just been something that grew out of a particular set of interests, but has multiplied, because I think that, back to the sociological imagination, you've got literally the world and its environment to play with, and so you're looking at all of the ways in which the world, the planet, populations, human or other species, are vulnerable, the way that they are at risk, but also the way in which we're looking at a picture of a beautiful coastal scene here on this Microsoft whatever screen. Nature's part of the fabric, the wallpaper, the cultural wallpaper that surrounds us, and it features in. This is getting into a book plug. It features in movies, and of course it's always been in literature, it's always been in art. It's just so much part of our culture that sometimes people are aware of and sometimes people aren't aware of, but it's very, very powerful, and that's the green cultural criminology perspective coming through there. And Abby Brisbane and I have just, Abby, another long-time collaborator, have just finished a book called Monstrous Nature, which is about representations of environmental harm in various media, various forms of media. It's a sequel to Green Cultural Criminology. So I think a lot of people, or quite a few people, probably do what I would see as green cultural criminology without necessarily calling themselves green cultural criminologists, because the environment is everywhere, and these issues are everywhere.
My last question is, you have researched on different topics, from private policing to drugs, even prisons, green criminology, but what are the themes or values or principles or perspectives that cuts across those topics?
Power and exploitation, I suppose. Private security, and the most recent work I've done about that is not that I left private security in a way. It simply moved to more recent work has been about enclaves and the securitization of environments that the very rich create for themselves, so that in the event of global apocalypse or environmental doom, they will have their bunkers, they will have their cruise ships, they will have their retreats and so on. And that's protected by privatized forms of military and security. And Anita Lamb and Avi and I have written about that in a couple of places, and I did something with our son Daniel on this as well, because that was also about the way in which the public sphere has been commercialized and privatized. So I think power and the ownership of the planet, the ownership of resources, the protection of those resources, that's what private forces are about. You don't necessarily need to care about that part of the planet if your part of the planet is making you a profit and this other part of the planet is your private paradise. So I think power is probably the main theme, and from that follow various other things, exploitation and conflict and so on. And there's a series of books by the I was going to say American, but he's not American, British sociologist Michael Mann, but he spent most of his career after being at Essex. Spent most of his career at UCLA. He wrote 3 books, I think, on the sources of social power, which is partly kind of military history, but also about just very, very scholarly works on how power permeates society through the centuries in different ways. And I think you don't have to be a Foucauldian to see that, we live in societies permeated by power. And it's if there's a theme, that might be it.
Okay, thank you for the interview.